Hi, this is Rob Sheen from the Source Conference, and I'm here with Thomas Fischer, who's a global security advocate and an independent consultant. So he's going to be speaking at Source Boston on May 9th and 10th of 2018, and his talk title is GDPR, Why It Matters Now, and that could not be a more timely topic given the timeliness of GDPR. So we're glad to have you at the conference, and can't wait to hear about it.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I mean, it is timely, especially so the conference is 2 weeks before GDPR enforcement comes into play. So it's actually really, really well timed, so to speak. Yeah, so I mean, the talk, I basically submitted this talk, and I've been doing rounds of various versions of this talk for a good reason. Is that when you look at what's going on in our industry, a lot of the GDPR discussion has been focused around, oh, we need to be, use this product to be compliant, or use it. You need to do your GDPR compliance. And typically when we think of that, especially for practitioners, compliance is a risk and compliance problem, right? So you have a checklist, you do a bunch of things, and you might deploy a few solutions if you have to, but it's more about really mitigating your risk in that sense. However, if you actually look at the GDPR, it's a lot more complex, and there's a lot more to be done, and long-term activities that need to be done, and it's really much more about accountability, and that you have enough process, procedures, and even maybe the people around to be able to do that accountability, because it's going to be a lot harder to basically explain to a data protection authority why that personal data was in a leak or was breached.
Right. So I noticed that in your abstract, you had mentioned the difference between that it's not just about compliance, but about changing processes and procedures, which I find interesting because most of the other rules and regulations we've had over the years have been pretty much about compliance. So
Right.
Why is this one different? Why are people going to suddenly shift to process and procedure and just not find the easiest way to check the box?
So I mean, the classic one that most people kind of highlight is the 72-hour breach notification, right? So GDPR says that you have to basically notify that personal data has been breached within 72 hours. Now, there's various discussions on how that has to be done, who has to do it, why, and various options. But if you think about that from a practitioner's point of view, so what happens when something, you get breached, right? Whether it's somebody internal, or whether it's an external threat that's, something like what we've seen in the past year, right? Some of the major breaches that we've seen in the past year. The first thing that you do is, I've detected a breach. Okay, I'm going to bring in the incident response team. I'm going to look at how it happened. I'm going to try and mitigate and stop it from happening again. And we never think about doing incident response focused on the data, right? So if you think about your typical incident response process, it's always focused on the means, the mechanisms, and the threat actor maybe, but you never really focus it on what happened to the data. It's always an afterthought. It was an afterthought in the last few big data breaches, and it keeps getting corrected. So if you need to, essentially, under what the guidance of the GDPR says right now, is that if you need to tell or notify people that their data has been breached within 72 hours, you're fundamentally going to have to change the way that you do your incident response process, because you're going to have to figure out what data has been touched within those 72 hours. And that's where it's no longer a checkbox activity, right? It's no longer, well, I have these solutions in place, I'm compliant. No, you're not, because the whole aspects of GDPR is being able to say, well, somebody's breached me, I need to report it to the DPA. So how do I do that? How do I do that constructively with personal data in that aspect? There's also the reverse side, which is the GDPR brings back rights to the data subject, right, to the end user. So me as a European citizen, and despite the fact I live in the UK, I actually am French, so I will remain a European citizen for quite a few more years. I have rights to come back and ask you, correct my data or remove my data from your database, remove my information. You have to handle that, right? It's not, you don't have to have a checkbox to say, oh, I'm doing data erasure. No, you have to have a procedure in place that if somebody calls you and says, I want my data removed from your company, you have to be able to do it, and you have to be able to demonstrate you've done it. And that's not a compliance checklist. That's procedure and process, right? It's something that needs to be done. It might extend from your customer service desk all the way to your IT department. And that's essentially what I've been trying to cover in this talk, is that it just really does go much further than than just doing a checklist and understanding the GDPR. And then, I mean, that's where I've always had this problem with when people talk about compliance for GDPR, right? Yes, you can be compliant in the sense of, oh, I've prepared my organization for it, but the compliance is to comply with the orders of the GDPR. You're going to have to demonstrate on a daily basis that nothing's happened to that personal data.
Right. So, I guess, what size company does this apply to? So, because a lot of the bigger companies that already have compliance teams, they'll have an easier time managing this, but the smaller and medium businesses that, maybe not be doing anything, what are they supposed to do?
And that's a big problem, and you're not the first person to ask me this question, actually. I have a concrete example, really. So I've been advising this customer that's based in Switzerland, so they're not even in the EU, right? So, but they deal with EU citizens because basically what they do is they offer a service via larger organizations. So a large organization might call them up and say, okay, we need this service for this employee. So they need to collect things like passport information, they need to collect names, family information, and things like that. And I mean, this company is very small. I think they have about less than 10 employees, right? But the larger organizations are saying you need to demonstrate that you can comply with the GDPR, that you're protecting personal data. So the size doesn't really matter anymore because of the relationships that have been set up in the GDPR between data controller, which is the company that collects the data, and data processor, which is any company that basically offers a service to a data controller. So it can be a small company like that one, or it can be Amazon with AWS, or Office or Microsoft with Office 365. They all need to have an aspect of being able to comply with the GDPR mandate, because the responsibility is not, although the controller is ultimately responsible for notifying, they need to be able to be told by the data processor, the third party, that something's happened to that personal data. And there is no mandate in the GDPR that says, oh, it only applies to XYZ type companies, right? It's about personal data. And I think this is one of the things that's very hard to understand, especially for people outside of the EU, is that this whole thing is about changing the rights of who owns that personal data, right? So it's defining that the data subject owns the data and he has the right to do and to query about that personal data. So a company that's collecting personal data is just a guarantor, or just a provider of services around that personal data. So they need to be able, I said personal data a lot there. So they need to be able to essentially respond to that data subject and to be able to provide those services as they're defined by the GDPR. And that doesn't define any size of organization. Anybody that has personal data could eventually be, responsible to do that.
Sure. That brings up an interesting point about the data subject owning their data, because that's kind of not how it is in the US. If you give your data away, it's gone and it's theirs, and they can do whatever they want with it. They can sell it, whatever. There are privacy concerns, and there are issues if certain types of private data do get out. But fundamentally, we don't have this idea that I own my data everywhere and I can control it. Like if I go and tell Facebook, hey, take all my data off Facebook, they'd be like, yeah, no. So do you see anything like this maybe ever catching on outside of Europe, or do you think it'll be isolated to Europe? And in particular, it's interesting, especially with the penalties, because the penalties are huge. 4% of revenue, or 10 million euros, is a massive fine.
Yeah, so Yeah, it's 2% or 10 million if
Oh,
it's
2%. Okay.
yeah, if it's standard personal data. The 4%, 20 million is if you have multiple issues and plus it's focused on what we call sensitive data. Because I mean, that's a whole different subject. But the GDPR actually has different categorization of personal data. But to come back to your point about will it catch on elsewhere? I think you know, I have a lot of I know a lot of people in the US. I have a lot of friends in the US. When we talk about this, it falls back down to history, right? So if you think about Europe and historically how Europe has had its issues, in the back, with different types of things that have affected people in very physical manners, right? Very intense physical manners. So there's a history of people being weary of anybody who's collecting your information or trying to catalog you and from that personal aspect. So fundamentally, yes, in Europe there is an attitude towards that. It's my personal data, so I keep it to myself. I mean, somewhat like the US, the UK doesn't have an ID card for many different reasons, right? They've never legally been able to push through a ID card for UK citizens, right? While other European countries have done it because they've done it in certain ways that are controlled and the data is segregated and only the official organizations can issue IDs. Will it catch on elsewhere? Yes, I think was it South Korea 6 months ago they started working on a new data protection law that's got similarities with the EU. The one that I laugh at, the one that makes me grimace actually is, because we think 4%, 20 million is a lot. Turkey has literally almost a word for word data protection law because they actually want to be in the EU. The fine is a lot worse, though. The fine can be years in the Turkish prison.
Oh, wow.
Could you imagine having to spend years in a Turkish prison because you failed to protect a person's data?
Maybe that would actually get people to do it.
So, will it catch on in the same way? No, but I think we will see fundamental, and because of what's been happening with the big data breaches that we saw over the past year, 2 years. I don't want to mention names of companies because it just brings out debates about which company did what and who's responsible. But when you look at what's been going on, it's true that we're seeing a fundamental shift in attitude, even by legislation or by lawmakers, but saying that something has to be done, right? It can't carry on like this. Whether it's a shift in mentality like the GDPR portrays, or whether it's just reinforcing laws and building new laws that will bring a level of protection of the data. And that's why also, it's another reason why I tend to avoid the subject of privacy in the discussions, because privacy has a much deeper meaning than data protection, right? Privacy can be also, you can't, if you've collected data, you can't ever show it to anybody else. While that's not really the point of the GDPR. The GDPR is about ensuring that the data is collected properly and used properly, right? It's not if you've given the subject his rights back and he's owner of the data, he's willingly giving it to you based on the fact that you've told him exactly what you're going to do with it. From that point on, there's no longer privacy. There's no real fundamental privacy issue because there's kind of an agreement between you and the company, or between the data subject and the company, that data is being used for that purpose, right? So there is something to be done. While if you think about, for me, privacy is about saying, well, I've closed all my curtains and I don't want you to see anything in my house. While if I'm giving you a part of if I'm showing you a part of what's in my house, I've given you the right to look at that part of my house, right? So that's where I finally kind of break down on the privacy versus data protection, which unfortunately, a lot of times, when I hear the debates about data protection laws in outside of the EU, it always falls back down to that privacy thing, right? It's like you said it at the beginning of the question, right? In the US, we don't have that, you don't have really that sense of privacy and that sense of want of privacy, or at least your data is not private when it's collected, right? Or you don't even know that companies are collecting your personal data, right? In some cases. So yeah, I mean, I think we'll see shifts in legislation. I don't see it being as strong as what we've done in Europe in terms of the data subject rights, but we're going to see a shift in legislation.
Cool.
That's for sure.
Awesome. All right. Well, we look forward to continuing the conversation at Source Boston, and I'll definitely see you there on May 9th and 10th. And for those that want to continue the conversation with Thomas, come on by to Source Boston, and we'll hang out. It'll be fun.
Yeah, it will.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, bye.